Paul Hindemith was living in the United States when he composed his final and most monumental work for piano, his response to J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, the second book of which had been written almost exactly 2 centuries earlier. The work under review here is his 1942 Ludus Tonalis, whose title is probably better understood as play of tones than anything like fun with notes, with play designating a theatrical work, a drama that unfolds across 25 separate but interdependent movements. As you can see from the frontispiece, Ludus Tonalis has a didactic purpose consisting of studies in counterpoint, tonal organization, and piano playing. The contrapuntal objectives are realized in 11 interludes of diverse character and especially in the fugues, of which there are 12 of various types. The tonal organization is along the lines of Hindemith's theory of intervals, articulated in his 3-volume craft of musical composition, ranging from most consonant, the perfect fifth, to most dissonant, the tritone. So it is that the first of the fugues centers on C as the point of reference, followed by fugues in G, F, A, E, E flat, A flat, D, B flat, D flat, B, and F sharp. Notice that modality is not mentioned in this enumeration because in Hindemith's music generally, the 12 chromatic pitch classes are used so liberally that the modality is constantly shifting, making such traditional designations as major and minor worse than useless. The fugues are both separated and bound together by interludes, and the whole is framed by a prelude and postlude that are themselves intimately, inextricably connected. The table of contents illustrates the points I've just made without, unfortunately, mentioning the keys. At the top are the first few measures of the Preludium, which begins in C and ends in F sharp. At the very bottom are the opening bars of the Postludium, which makes the opposite tonal journey, bringing the composition back home to C. In the left-hand column are the subjects of the 12 fugues, the first in C, the second in G, the third in F, and so on. The right-hand column lists the intervening interludes, many of which begin in or near the key of the fugue just finished, then modulate to the key or one near related of the fugue that follows. Motivic connections are also commonly heard between adjacent movements, binding fugues and interludes even more closely together. There are 25 movements in all, and they exhibit a striking symmetry around the central movement, a march in E flat, which is positioned on the midpoint between C and the tone that lies a tritone away. In this video, I'll describe the individual movements, and in a follow-up video, a rough draft of which some of you have already seen, I'll present the score with music in a recording by Hans Petermantel. The composition opens with a magnificent preludium whose 3 main parts lay out a sumptuous feast of themes, gestures, and flourishes that augurs a musical cornucopia to follow. The opening is flamboyant and heraldic, unbound by metrical constraints, and chock full of bold strokes that, in the first 2 measures to the downbeat of the third, forecast in microcosm the macrocosmic whole. The first bar opens with a C 2 octaves above middle C, you'll want to keep this in mind, and continues with a tumbling, accelerating melody consisting of jagged intervals that suggest the key centers of the coming fugues, hitting the wall of the first chord of the piece, a glorious A-flat major 7th in second inversion on the next downbeat. A powerful melodic gesture then forces the harmony downward another whole step to G-flat major, also in second inversion, and with that we have reached the remotest position possible from the barely established tonic, the tritone that in a sense defines the composition's overall structure. A brusque, muscular finish forces everything back to C via that most powerful of cadences, the Phrygian, and the opening paragraph continues impressionistically, with rippling arpeggios filling a subtly rising and falling melody, almost imperceptibly giving way to rocketing figures that explode in measure 7 like a trout leaping from the water of a burbling mountain stream, breaking on the same 3 notes that opened the movement, now an octave higher and with particular emphasis. A kickstart of quintuplets, and the journey downstream continues, ever more precipitously, crashing anon onto the piano's lowest C sharp, setting up a misspelled Phrygian cadence for the opening paragraph's conclusion on a C 3 octaves below middle C. You've probably noticed that the highest and lowest notes of this inaugural paragraph have both been Cs, and that there have been 7 octaves worth of that pitch class represented. The Preludium's second paragraph is a sweet, sad triple-time aria that begins in apparent F minor, drifts freely among key centers as remote as C-sharp minor, and circles back around to C major to finish. As you can see, this passage exhibits a 3-voice texture with a measure of independence granted each of the lines. This description applies to all of the fugues and many of the interludes. And as I'll be making reference to those voice parts when analyzing the fugues, I should probably go ahead and explain my approach. I will always refer to the top voice, no matter how low it may lie, as the soprano. I will always refer to the bottom voice, no matter how high it may lie, as the bass voice. The middle voice I will refer to either as alto or tenor, depending on where it lies with respect to middle C, and even in that I have not been entirely consistent. I hope that will forestall any confusion that might otherwise arise when fuguing time comes round. A sudden surge of musical adrenaline goads the line back to the high C that began it all, and a tumbling cascade of pitches ends with a low F sharp, setting the stage for the final part of the movement. A solemn chaconne theme is assembled little by little, and with a shift into 15/8 time, that theme in the bass begins grinding slowly away as long-breathed phrases in solemn block chords mount to fortissimo and subside again, leaving the music unresolved on the dominant of the key farthest from the composition's starting point. The first of the fugues, established on the composition's reference point, C, is a monumental triple fugue, with each of its subjects granted its own exposition plus some development, and then the 3 brought together for a final exposition. The 3 subjects are not long, only 3 measures, but the tempo is slow, so the musical horizon is a broad one that shifts slowly. Taking a look at the first subject's constituent pitches, the first 3, with their pronounced quartal flavor, suggest C aeolian, with the melody beginning on the dominant, settling onto the tonic, and springing to the subtonic to begin its descent. The A flat is in line with this interpretation, but the G flat that follows marks a shift, leaving the usably diatonic world of C for the distant realms of D flat. The suave voice leading on display here, Hindemith finding and exploiting the common tones between C aeolian and D flat major, will permeate the composition and accounts for a high degree of harmonic slipperiness. And having given the account you just heard, I must also say that another reading is possible, that the tonal center remains on C the whole time, while the mode shifts as far away as the Locrian. It will often be the case that more than one interpretation of a passage is both thinkable and defensible. The exposition of this first subject, I've called it subject A, occupies the first 10 measures, beginning with the alto voice, continuing with the soprano, and finishing with the bass. The exposition of subject B begins in measure 11, with the soprano singing its at first hesitant, then determined line over the course of 3 measures. The answers, which come in the alto then bass, convey the argument as far as measure 19, where a 2-bar extension ensues. Next up is subject C, a 3-measure portrait of steely determination in generally longer note values that mounts slowly through an octave. This is heard first in the soprano, beginning in measure 21, where the bass voice simultaneously presses subject B into service as a countersubject. The answers are heard in the alto, then bass. There's a brief stretto on the opening idea of subject B. This is in bars 30 through 34. Thus is the way prepared for the final exposition, the bringing of all 3 subjects together in the tightest imaginable embrace. This begins in measure 35 and is marked very quiet. That counterpoint that looks so beautiful on the page falls equally beautifully on the ear. I can't begin to tell you how much I admire this passage. The movement ends quietly as the pull of C draws all 3 voice parts unto itself. The first interlude stands in highest thinkable contrast to the serene, unhurried music we just heard. It seems doubtful to me that anyone hearing this music without the score would guess the meter correctly. The same uneasy relationship between notated triple time and apparent quadruple time also defines the first movement of the same composer's symphony in B-flat, the one for wind band. This music throbs with irrepressible energy, punctuated by outbursts of chords so richly scored they sound symphonic, charging furiously this way and that, tracing its high-strung course from a boisterous C major through a mounting crisis to a sudden halt and a delicate G major ending that prepares the way for the second fugue. It's apt to leave one breathless. The second fugue, centering on G, affords no relief from that exertion, for this is a wild dance in 5/8 time, bursting at the seams. Although its hammered, then vaulting subject is only 2 measures long, its continuation initially leaves the impression of a larger subject presented in stretto. This impression does not, however, hold up beyond the first extended exposition, 5 iterations in all, which occupies the first 17 measures and returns anon to G. From measure 18, we have a second fugal exposition, this one of the subject's inversion, and then a great deal of development, much of it quite free, punctuated by a tight stretto from bar 36, and the fugue's last blast is a determined sounding coda that features 4 final iterations of the subject in the bass, presented without respect to the bar lines. Somehow it all works out. The next interlude is a sweet pastoral established on pitch class G and set in the swaying, dotted rhythms of the Siciliana. The first of its paragraphs makes the journey from tonic to dominant with a noteworthy, but for Hindemith unsurprising, emphasis on C sharp minor, a key lying a tritone distant from the tonic. In its second half, the pastoral rises to a harmonically ambiguous peak of, let's call it angst, and then falls away for a gentle supine conclusion with mixolydian overtones. The fugue that follows is an expansive mirror fugue whose second half is an exact retrograde of the first. As you can see, the subject is a monumental one and calls for some comment. The opening features a written-out accelerando of pitches that are deployed quartily and suggest a single diatonic collection. This harmonic stability is overruled by the continuation, which introduces enough chromatic pitches to the mix that by the time the subject reaches its arrival note at the downbeat of bar 7, 11 of the 12 pitch classes have been used. Because of the subject's length, the exposition runs all the way to the downbeat of measure 19, where a dulcet interlude stands in and fills some time. At measure 23, a brief stretto is set up between the soprano and bass voices, with the former singing the subject in inversion, with some adjustment to rhythmic values, against an answer in the latter in prime form, and with values also adjusted. This feature of the fugue is finished at the downbeat of 30, from which point all that has been heard so far is presented in retrograde, with an allowance made to maintain 3-voice counterpoint all the way to the movement's F major conclusion. The mode shifts to the parallel minor to begin the third interludium, a mercurial gavotte whose material is set forth in 3 repeated strains. As you can see, the harmonic trajectory of this movement is extremely unsettled, with the first strain beginning in F minor and finishing with a half cadence in A flat minor, the second beginning in B minor and ending in A flat major, and the third commencing and ending in A minor. From the midpoint of bar 22, the first strain returns, now a half step lower than originally, and the third strain, now functioning as an E minor coda, finishes the interlude. Fugue number 4 is a monumental double fugue in what I have called in earlier analyses dialectic form. Although the movement begins in apparent F major, its goal is A and will be reached by way of a great exertion. The first of the fugues is a proud, assertive thing whose short, emphatic subject is declared by the tenor voice and answered by the soprano and bass respectively, the exposition reaching its ringing conclusion on the third beat of measure 8. A second exposition ensues, this time with the subject inverted, and a vigorous stretto pitting both those permutations against each other finishes the first fugue emphatically in E major. For the second fugue, Fugue B in my accounting, everything changes: meter, mood, tempo, style. The shy, skittish, Dorian-flavored subject is first heard in the alto voice, answered by the soprano and bass, respectively. A brief fill consisting of some aloof, remote-sounding music opens the way to a middle entry in the soprano with the answer coming from the bass, after which that filler music resumes to close this alternative fugue. From measure 45, the synthesis begins with a return to the original tempo and manners, lending the entire movement its ABA form shape, and the fugue ends powerfully in A major. The next interludium is a lightning-fast toccata in rondo form, featuring a near-perpetual outpouring of semiquavers against eighth notes and the most fluid of harmony. The refrain begins with the white key diatonic collection, but reaches its terminal cadence on C-sharp Phrygian in the eighth measure. The first episode ensues, beginning in the lower reaches of the piano and rising little by little to its original position and the first partial return of the refrain at measure 15. The second episode, which lies between repeat signs, explores the higher regions of the instrument, and a vigorous retransitional passage with both hands in unison at the interval of a 15th restores the refrain for its final return, beginning this time at mid-bar in measure 29. A brief, relentless coda lays the movement to rest quietly in E Phrygian. This prepares the way for the fifth fugue established on that same pitch class. This one is a gigue with a long subject, which is nevertheless dispatched in a short time owing to the movement's galloping tempo. This fugue treats the subject in both prime form and inversion and ends powerfully in E major. Interludium 5 is a romantic miniature in the style of Chopin, with two clearly defined themes and sonata-form bona fides. The first theme begins in E major and finishes in B, with the second taking it up from there, putting the music through some harmonic paces and restoring E major for the return of theme 1, which this time ends in the tonic. The second theme follows suit, veering off into uncharted territory near the end and finishing in apparent B-flat minor, a sweet little entr'acte gone sour at the end. Fugue number 6 is one of the most precious things you can hope to hear, taking up the final pitch of the foregoing interludium, turning that note to an E-flat major use, and reeling out some very delicate Rococo-style music. There are several expositions, including treatments of the inverted subject, and the movement ends quietly after veering off into the enharmonic weeds with music that nevertheless lands on the ear, which cannot see, like E-flat major. This completes the first half of Ludus Tonalis' fugal project, and it's time for the march. As I indicated in passing, there's a striking symmetry to Ludus Tonalis, with the sixth interlude serving as the hinge line of the whole, and it would probably be profitable to call up the table of contents again and see if you can spot the symmetrical elements. I will not mention them further, as there's plenty more to address in a video that is certainly going to exceed many viewers' voluntary time commitment. Despite an overall mock-serious flavor, the ABA form march does its best to entertain with passages that exude infectious humor. For theme A, the E-flat major march proper, Hindemith has employed a repeat that yields the overall formal pattern AABA. Tucked into that simple pattern is one of the tidiest, most compact sonata structures you can ever hope to encounter. Follow my analysis and you'll see what I mean. The recapitulatory passage, the return of the first paragraph's music an octave higher, is truncated, and that's because the neoclassical Hindemith has a formal trick up his sleeve to be enjoyed later. Next up is theme B, which functions as the march's trio, set in the next darker key of A-flat major, but with a bracing excursion into the remote regions of B major and G major. Here, the expansive theme is ferried along by a trotting bass line, and the theme is repeated to wonderful effect. The written-out da capo reprise of the main theme is shorn of its repeat, but this time its second idea, an embryonic second theme in my analysis, is brought back in the tonic, and the umbrella of sonata form is thus unfurled over the entire movement. Very clever. The motivic connection between the march and the fugue that follows is one of the tightest and most readily apparent of the entire set. Here, too, the subject is an ample one, presented first in a three-voice exposition and brought back in several middle entries. The developmental interludes in this fugue are far more lyrical and substantive in their own right than in most, and the ending on a neuter cadence on C with a Phrygian approach belies the fugue's commitment to A-flat as tonal center. The next interlude is magisterial, a romantic miniature in the style of Brahms, beginning in A-flat major and making the journey of a tritone. The music is laid out in 4 broad paragraphs, with the right hand's 2 polyphonically deployed voices singing effusively over a walking bass line in broken octaves, occasionally doubled and eventually filled in with fifths. The climax is searing, reaching the loudest dynamic level Hindemith wrote, and then subsiding to a quiet finish on D, Picardy cadence implied. The fugue on D is a stiff, brittle, and most entertaining dance in apparent 5/4 time despite the 4/4 signature. This sassy little contrapuntal display opens and closes with complete expositions of the subject, which is also treated in a couple of stretti framed by witty developmental episodes. The open final cadence lends a curiously archaic sound to this brief, flamboyant exercise, less than a minute in length, all told. Interludium 8, which features the fastest music of Ludus Tonalis, is organized in ABA form. As in instances encountered earlier, this interlude begins in the key of the fugue that preceded it and makes its tonal journey to the key of the following fugue. Its primary theme is often divided between the hands, and the contrasting central section features more flowing conjunct lines, often moving in contrary motion. A powerful, somewhat eruptive transition in the style of theme A summons the return of that theme, now a half step higher and contriving to end in B-flat major with a scintillating final gesture. The fugue in B-flat is surely one of the most charming, coquettish fugues ever written, but those innocent qualities mask ambitious aims, for this ample dissertation treats its amiable, insouciant subject in its prime form, its inversion, its retrograde inversion, and in rhythmic augmentation. That's going to take a while, and there's plenty here to entertain you royally while it lasts. The contrasts in Ludus Tonalis are often gripping. We leave that good-humored fugue behind as we embark on an interlude that offers at once the most serious and most intimate music of the entire work, a movement that begins in B-flat where the fugue left off and wins its slow, tortuous way to the impossibly remote position of G-flat minor by the end. Over its course, the music rises from an inward-directed lament to a pitch of sustained sorrow and then subsides, its final sounds embracing most of the piano's keyboard and fading into deathly silence. The 10th fugue is another mirror fugue, but the mirroring is handled differently from what we encountered in fugue number 3, in which the mirror image was a retrograde of the first half. Here, the second half of the fugue is essentially an inversion of the first half, and many of its cadences are filled with elaborate flourishes that seem to have been borrowed from some distant musical universe that knows how to have fun with notes. The overall setting is on D-flat, the major seventh being the antepenultimate dissonance in Hindemith's accounting of the consonance of intervals whenever C is the reference. A shift in mode and in inharmonic spellings inaugurates the 10th interlude, a vigorous courant in C-sharp minor with plenty of ear-stretching bitonality. The form of this muscular movement is identical to that of the march, and its sonata implications are just as apparent, although I have omitted mention of them from my analysis. The main theme is a driven thing, unfolding over an ostinato bass line and accented provocatively. A central contrasting section in C major, a trio in traditional terms, features tripping chords in the right hand accompanying an athletic melody in the bass. When the main theme returns, it is set a whole step lower and thus prepares the way for the penultimate fugue. Fugue 11, which begins and ends in B, is the most curious of the set. Not a proper fugue in the strictest sense, but rather a monumental specimen of imitative counterpoint presented as a canon between alto and soprano voices, floating serenely above a slowly treading bass line. The imitation is at the perfect fifth at 2-measure intervals and is maintained faithfully throughout. An extended rest in the leading voice, the alto, serves a partitioning function that defines the 2-part form, which Hindemith has also indicated with a light double bar line. This is yet another example of counterpoint that's as gratifying to the eye as to the ear, practically a specimen of Augenmusik. The B tonic is retained to begin the final interludium, an amiable romantic-style waltz with an emphatic trio that begins like a celebration but strays repeatedly into harmonic confusion. The genial opening waltz, Waltz A in my analysis, is set in B major with an ear-catching departure and return achieved over the first 28 measures. Waltz B explodes onto the scene by jumping the metric gun in apparent D major. This trio, if you like, unfolds in 2 strains, both of which shade off into tonal uncertainty and are treated to written out elaborated repeats, the second of which finally limps into its G-sharp minor close, a tritone distant from where the trio apparently began. Waltz A returns in its original key and mostly follows its earlier course until the modulatory impulse seizes it and drives it into C-sharp major, where it finishes. An ample coda reinforces this new tonal center and ends there, setting the stage for the final fugue. With Fugue 12, we reach the most dissonant position with respect to the first fugue's established tonal standard, according to Hindemith's theory of harmony. Unsurprisingly, this is among the work's most monumental fugues and certainly the most dramatic. It lies in 2 large, clearly defined parts of roughly equal length, the first both opening and closing at the dominant of F sharp, and the second, which you'll see on the following page, beginning at the apparent dominant of D and returning to F sharp to close. This is a stretto fugue, meaning that the answers overlap the subject or preceding answer before the latter is finished. You see this before you in the fugue's exposition. The subject given by the alto is 3 measures long and consists of 2 phrases, the first a keening lament that hugs the dominant and declines, and the second an arching closing figure that finishes on the tonic. The subject is practically a Schenkerian reduction of itself. As you can see, the soprano voice begins its answer before the alto's first phrase is finished, and this overlap by 2/3 will result in a heightened level of polyphony throughout. Furthermore, the second phrase of the subject also finds employment as a countersubject. The exposition is completed with the finishing of the bass voice's answer in measure 7, and the 3-measure episode that follows traces the rising and falling contours of a musical arch while unsettling the even, languid flow of 9/8 time with sly rhythmic displacements. Another partial exposition follows in the bass, answered by the alto. This passage has a B minor beginning, but after a side trip through D sharp minor, settles on C sharp to finish. There is a formal closing that begins with the soprano voice's E sharp upbeat to measure 15. The sad little tune with a modally ambiguous accompaniment occupies a measure and a half with a C sharp minor cadence. The tune then gravitates to the bass voice for a second statement with a falling counter melody in the soprano, and the closing ends in modal neutrality. A brief melodic anacrusis in the bass voice brings part 2 of this fugue, which opens with another partial exposition with the bass voice calling and the soprano answering, finishing in A minor in measure 22. An agitated 3-bar development ensues, mounting forcefully to an intense peak at measure 26, where the anguished subject returns in the soprano, wailing as with grief. The music works through its sorrows over the course of 8 closely reasoned measures and relaxes finally into the solace of F sharp major. The solemn closing heard earlier at the dominant level now returns in the tonic, and a major chord of F sharp ratifies the completion of Hindemith's monumental fugal project. All that remains is to frame the whole with the postludium, which will make the journey back home to C. I've already mentioned the relationship between the Preludium and the Postludium, the latter being a presentation of the former in retrograde inversion. To bring that point home, I present here the first and last pages of Ludus Tonalis side by side. It should be apparent that the hinge line for the inversion is middle C. I'm going to make the relationship even more obvious now by rotating the final page 180 degrees and removing the extra system. As you can see, Hindemith wanted the visual experience to be as though the player had gone back to the Preludium after finishing the 12th fugue and turned it upside down. The only addendum is the final C major chord, which ratifies the whole project. I confess that I have not made my peace with an artistic choice that appears to have been made not with a view to a desired musical outcome, but as a kind of joke, a response to a visual amusement. This seems arbitrary to me, and I have doubts as to whether the result can possibly be coherent. It is, after all, as though you were to read a book chapter aloud and record it, and then read it backwards, not word by word, but phoneme by phoneme, while reversing all of your original pitch inflections. That would be a more or less accurate analogy. What hope would there be for coherence under those circumstances? Would even the original grammar and syntax leave so much as a trace in the reverse accounting? Now that I've got that off my chest, let's take a look at the postludium. The reversed inversion begins with the closing sound of the preludium now opening the final movement high in the sopranino register of the piano. The chaconne theme begins cycling slowly but in the stratosphere instead of gnawing away at the foundations of the earth. The passage swells and subsides, but this time, because we're working backwards, there's more, starting with that hesitant approach to the chaconne, now played in reverse. The sad little waltz is also played backwards, its formerly clear phraseology now vanished beneath what sounds like an aimless counterpoint exercise. Something like that seems true to me of the remainder of the postludium. Musically speaking, it's more like an undoing than a doing. I suppose what I've been saying comes close to heresy, but I do intend my commentaries to be honest, after all. This is where I'll leave it. Despite the reservations I've expressed regarding the final movement, Hindemith's 1942 landmark, a summa of his polyphonic and harmonic thinking, has given me sustained joy over the month I've spent with it, and it's my pleasure to share this artifact of my journey of discovery. I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I had making it. You'll find a link to part 2 in the description below.